In this gripping story, Jessica, who has endured years of abuse at the hands of her husband Nicholas, decides to run away with her son John in search of a safer and happier life. Their journey leads them to an abandoned house in the woods where they meet Thomas, a man with his own troubled past. As Jessica and Thomas share their stories, a bond forms between them that offers hope and protection. Nicholas, in a rage, seeks out his wife for revenge. This story promises to be a gripping exploration of survival, the strength of the human spirit, and the power of newfound love. But about everything in order, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and leave a comment. Here we go. Jessica waited for her husband to get in the car and drive out of the yard. As soon as the car was gone, she rushed to her son's room. "John, get ready quickly. We're leaving." The boy looked at her with tearful eyes. "Where to?" "I don't know yet, John. Somewhere far away from here." John jumped up quickly. "Mom, are we going to get away from Daddy and he won't hurt you anymore?" "Yes, sweetheart. We just have to hurry to get as far away as possible while he's gone." "Mommy, are you sure he won't find us?" "We'll do our best so that when he finds us, we'll be safe." John grabbed the backpack. "Son, don't take too much stuff. We'll have to carry it all ourselves." Jessica quickly put some things into the bag, took out her passport from her husband's desk, her son's papers, and didn't take her cell phone, knowing that her husband would track her. Jessica had no money. Nicholas never gave her money. He bought everything himself, and he wouldn't let her go to work either. He said her duties were to look after the house, bring up her son, and please him in general. When Jessica and Nicholas met, he seemed so reliable, so good. Jessica herself was in a difficult situation. She had not yet had time to get a job after technical school. The housing she was supposed to get from the state was lost somewhere. Nicholas was her salvation, her guardian angel. Jessica thought until John was born. Now Nicholas could not hide his true colors. He began to humiliate, threaten, raise his hand against her. Jessica had no one to ask for protection, nowhere to go. She kept hoping that everything would get better, that it would go away. But then her husband started having mistresses, and he didn't even try to hide it from her, even though they were the perfect family to everyone. Today was the last straw when Nicholas once again began to beat Jessica. The son came between them. It pissed the head of the family off so much that he slapped John so hard that the boy flew into the corner of the room. It was at that moment that Jessica realized they were going to run away. The key was to file for divorce to get settled before Nicholas found them. She really hoped he'd back off. There were plenty of other women in the world, after all. She worried about John, though, as long as he didn't want to take him away, and she could expect anything from him. They left the gate and walked quickly to the bus stop, but at the last moment, Jessica changed her mind, deciding that she had to catch the bus somewhere else. They reached the edge of the cottage village, and Jessica remembered that once they had run through this forest and ended up on the other side of town. An hour later, they got on the bus, tired but satisfied, without even looking where it was going. They had to go a little way. It took them 4 stops, then a couple more stops. Anyway, now they were standing at a gazebo labeled "Stop" with nothing around them. Jessica heard the bus saying that the village wasn't far, big, nice, through the woods, about 15 minutes, and if you took the road, about 30 to 40 minutes. Jessica headed towards the forest. They were very tired. They needed to ask someone to stay with them, get a good night's sleep, and then think about what to do next. Jessica didn't understand how the path had gotten lost. John was talking nonstop, seeing a bird or a squirrel. Jessica listened, answered, laughed with him, and then, "Mom, are we lost?" "No, John, we'll find our own path and we'll get to the village." But the forest grew thicker and thicker, higher and higher. Soon it began to get dark. Jessica's mind was racing. What to do, how to spend the night in the forest. Then the forest parted. There was a clearing in front of them, and on it was a lonely house, Large, well-built, but apparently abandoned. Strange, who would want to build a house here? They walked towards the house. Jessica looked around warily but saw no sign of any living people. Oddly enough, the inside appeared to be in order. Jessica decided that they wouldn't touch anything. There might be a landlord after all. They ate the sandwiches Jessica had taken from home, and John fell asleep almost immediately. Jessica stared at the dark ceiling for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night. But then a dream came over her. She was dreaming about something scary she wouldn't remember in the morning, but she woke up and immediately realized that panic was gripping her because it wasn't the dream that broke her. It was the sound of the refrigerator door that broke her. She saw that there was one in the kitchen, an old one for sure. It had been standing there for ages. Jessica lifted herself up and froze in horror. There was a light on in the kitchen, a real electric light she hadn't even noticed if there were any wires running to the house. Jessica looked at her son in panic. Something had to be done, some way to save herself. She couldn't leave the house without anyone noticing her. There was only one thing left to do: try to negotiate with whoever was in the kitchen to let them go. Jessica slowly stood up, looking at her son again. What if someone in there is inadequate? She had no choice because the door from the kitchen to the room swung open. Light fell on Jessica, and she clutched her eyes in fear. At that, she immediately whispered, "Please forgive us. We thought the house was abandoned. That's why we took shelter in it. We just got lost. As soon as it blooms, we'll leave right away." A silhouette blocked the light. Jessica was looking at a big man about 10 years older than her. He had a broad beard, shaggy hair, and goggle eyes. He shifted his gaze to the bed where Jan slept and nodded to Jessica toward the kitchen. She sighed, turned around to look at her son, and stepped forward like she was going to an execution. The man must have realized what was going on in her head and shook his head with a chuckle. He closed the door to the kitchen, but not tightly so he could see the bed where John was sleeping. "Who are you and how did you end up here?" "It's a long story. I'm in no hurry. Let's start at the beginning. My name is Thomas." Jessica sighed again. She realized that it was probably best to tell everything, and if she started making things up, she might get confused. Best not to piss the man off, since she was barely up to his chest. It was kind of hard at first, but then she started talking. She didn't defend herself in any way, quite the opposite. Now Jessica realized that she should have run away a long time ago. The man listened attentively. When she finished, he asked, "I understand correctly, you have nowhere to go." "Yes, but don't worry, we'll leave in the morning." He smirked again, looked at her with blue eyes. "Where to, if it's no secret?" "To some village. We'll ask for a place to stay. And there, maybe I'll find some work." "In the village?" "Yes." Jessica looked at him fearfully. "What's wrong?" "If you don't know, there hasn't been a job in the village for 15 years. "Well, go to bed. I'll sleep in the room. There's the door. Tomorrow we'll think about it, and tonight we'll rest." He turned around and went out, but he came back quickly. "Here, take a blanket. It'll be chilly by morning. Freeze the baby." Jessica took the blanket and went to the bed where John was sleeping. Strangely, her soul was calmed. Not just the fear was gone, but a new feeling that they were not alone. They were protected. In the morning, she woke up when the sun was already high. John wasn't there. Jessica jumped up in horror and almost immediately saw her son. He was outside with Thomas. They were cleaning up the smooth rows of cut grass. John was smiling cheerfully and talking to Thomas about something. Strangely, they talked as if they had known each other for ages. Jessica stepped out onto the porch. "Good morning." John and Thomas turned to her. "Mommy, you're up." "Mom, you have no idea. Uncle Thomas promised to take me fishing." Jessica looked anxiously at her son. "What fishing trip?" "We have to keep going." "Mom, can't we stay a few days?" "Uncle Thomas says we can stay." Thomas came up to her. "You're not in a hurry, are you?" Your boy's never been fishing in his life." Jessica wanted to shout that he had never been anywhere, but she held back. Thomas sighed. "John and I have already had breakfast, but we probably won't say no to tea." Jessica smiled involuntarily. "Well, if you show me where everything is, I'll feed you. Not only breakfast, but also lunch. Shall we?" Thomas stepped inside, followed by John, and then Jessica. While Jessica hummed and did her chores, John and Thomas did something outside. When she came out, she gasped. Yesterday, the house had been drowning in weeds and tall grass, but now everything had been mowed and even cleaned up. Thomas saw her look and said, "There's no place for the child to play ball, and there might be a snake lurking in the grass." Thomas opened the barn and took out a beautiful ball. "Let's get you a gate, John." "I can't play with you all the time." John took every word of Uncle Thomas with such delight. In the evening, John fell asleep and Jessica and Thomas sat down in the kitchen to drink tea. "Thomas, if you don't want to answer, I understand, but still, what are you doing here?" "You don't look like a countryman," she smiled. "It didn't work out, did it?" "Oh, I tried so hard. My story is as banal as yours. My wife cheated on me with my best friend," Jessica gasped. "You killed them, and now you're hiding." Thomas looked at her in surprise, then laughed. "What a fantasy." "No, I didn't kill anyone. I was just too hurt by the double betrayal to take a break, so I came here. This house used to be my grandfather's. He was a forester here." Jessica smiled sadly. "It's good to have a place to hide." "I don't have a place." "Then stay. There's plenty of room for everyone. It's not far, 10 minutes' walk from the village. I'll show you." Jessica didn't say anything. It was all very well, but it was impossible to live without money. Now they would eat Thomas's food, and then what? A week went by very quickly, then another. One day, Jessica said to Thomas, "Thomas, how long can we sit on your neck?" "I have to do something. I have to find a place to go, a place to work, a place to live. You can't babysit us all the time." John was doing a pretty good job of putting the ball in the goal, and he couldn't hear them talking. "Jessica, it's not like I'm chasing you, but I totally understand. Why don't we all go back to the city together? I've got a big apartment. You can have your own room while you get settled." "The city?" Jessica looked at him fearfully. "But that's where Nicholas is." "Exactly. Are you going to spend the rest of your life hiding from him in the woods? That's not the point. What about John? He's going to school this year. He needs to socialize with his peers." 3 days later, they moved back into town with Thomas. Jessica didn't know if she was doing the right thing or not, but Thomas was telling the truth. She couldn't spend her whole life hiding herself and her son. When Jessica had told Thomas her story that first night in the forest home, she had mentioned that Nicholas had beaten her, but she didn't go into detail at the time. Then, when they were living together, one night they talked about it. Thomas had cautiously asked what exactly that subhuman had been doing, and Jessica told him how Nicholas had abused her, how he could slap her just because dinner wasn't ready on time, how he once dragged her by the hair out into the yard in her pajamas in winter, heat her down with ice water, and made her apologize to him on her knees, how he'd thrown plates and mugs at her, and then made her clean up the shards. Thomas listened, clenching his fists so white his knuckles turned white. His rage boiled inside him at the thought that this low bully coward had bullied his beloved Jessica in such a way. Thomas vowed that now this scumbag would never touch her or John again, that he would protect and defend them until his last breath. Jessica cried that night in his arms, crying out years of humiliation and fear, but she felt lighter and calmer. For now she had her guardian angel and support, her beloved Thomas. John and Thomas became very close over time. After moving to the city, they often spent time together. As Thomas promised, he took John fishing. The boy really liked this activity because before, his father had never taken him anywhere, and Thomas patiently taught John the wisdom of fishing. Then they began to go fishing regularly as soon as they had free time. Thomas taught John how to swim and dive in the lake. The boy felt that he could be himself without fear of ridicule or shouting. They could have heart-to-heart conversations for hours about anything. John shared with Thomas his dreams, experiences, impressions of books, and Thomas always listened with participation and gave sound advice. So gradually, Thomas became for John not just a stepfather, but a real father and an older friend. They were united by a strong male friendship, tempered by joint camping and fishing trips. Nicholas found Jessica a few months later. Jessica was working, and she loved it so much. She filed for divorce as soon as she arrived. Thomas was far from poor. He had his own business. It was a big apartment, though, but they didn't see each other much because Thomas was away at work. Jessica ran to the store and bought some fish. Thomas gave her money for household expenses, which she thought was too much, but he laughed and said that he spent a lot more on dinners in restaurants because he couldn't cook. She was almost to the driveway when a familiar voice called out to her, "Jessica, wait a minute." She stumbled. Terror swept over her. She recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to her husband, Nicholas. Jessica slowly turned around. Nicholas was standing next to her, his eyes narrowed, indicating the most intense level of rage. "Why are you acting so bad, wifey? Or have you relaxed? Didn't I bring you up enough?" He clenched his fists, and Jessica squirmed, covering her face with her hands. She heard some kind of slap, then a loud "oh." But there was no punch. Jessica cautiously opened her eyes. Nicholas was lying on the ground with Thomas towering over him. "Remember, weakling, if I ever see you near her or John again, I will bury you in the asphalt. You got it." "Who are you? Who the hell are you?" Thomas pulled out a business card and shoved it into Nicholas's pocket. "I'm the man who will keep them safe forever." He turned around, took the bag from Jessica's hands, and pushed her toward the entryway. Jessica walked and smiled. She had such hope. She was even afraid to admit to herself that she had fallen in love with Thomas like a girl. In front of the door, he asked, "When's the divorce?" "In 5 days. We have to get married, you realize?" He spoke in a long and rambling voice, and Jessica turned to him and gave him a quick kiss. "I agree." Thomas looked up, frozen, then asked, "And you won't be disgusted to live with me?" "I'm talking about real life." Jessica laughed. "How could it be disgusting with someone you love, Tom?" Thomas was a little confused, then dropped the package and picked her up in his arms. "Are you serious? I didn't even dare to dream of such a thing." Shortly after Jessica and Thomas married, they had a daughter. They named her Anna. GN was very proud to be a big brother. Nicholas didn't have any more problems with them. He seemed to have found a new victim and was now preoccupied with her. Jessica continued to work and loved coming home, where she was always greeted by her loving husband and 2 children. Thomas tried to spend as much time with his family as possible. When John went to school, he made many friends. Thomas and Jessica enjoyed watching their son grow up to be a healthy and fun-loving child. A few years later, another son was born to them. Now, both the baby and Anna ran after their older brother, and John willingly fiddled with them. Jessica thanked fate for this new life, full of love and family warmth next to Thomas. She truly blossomed and believed in herself and her strength. After Nicholas ran into Thomas at Jessica's doorstep, he didn't show up for a while, but a couple of months later, Jessica happened to see him on the street. Nicholas was walking with his arm around a skinny girl in her 20s. Jessica realized from her frightened look that this poor girl had fallen into the clutches of a tyrant and a domestic abuser. Jessica and Thomas had seen Nicholas several times with different women. Apparently, he would find a victim, marry her, and then, when she ran away, look for the next unfortunate one. When John grew older, Jessica once talked to him about his former father. It turns out he tried to get in touch with his son a couple of times, but John stayed away from the guy. He loved his real dad, Thomas. The last time they heard from Nicholas was about 5 years ago. They say he married some rich widow. I guess he got lucky, and now he may not be looking for another victim, but just enjoying life at her expense. After Nicholas married the rich widow, he was happy at first. Finally, life was getting better, no money problems, he could not work and just enjoy himself. However, over time it turned out that his new spouse was an overbearing, dominant woman. She constantly humiliated and insulted Nicholas, forced him to fulfill humiliating whims, and he tolerated all her antics. The fact that she made a will in his favor. Therefore, Nicholas hoped to endure, and after her death, to get a rich inheritance. For the sake of this, he was ready to bear any humiliation from his own wife. However, in the end, such a life broke him. Nicholas drank himself to sleep, almost lost his mind from constant abuse, and then the widow changed her mind and amended the will, depriving her husband of the right of inheritance. In the end, Nicholas was left with nothing. The cruel, dominant spouse threw him out on the street, taking all his money and property. So the boomerang of his misdeeds came back and ruined Nicholas's own life. As John grew older, it was hard for him to realize and believe what his own father, Nicholas, had once done. He heard stories from his mom about the beatings and humiliation she suffered from this cruel and heartless man, and he couldn't understand how it was even possible to beat and torture his own wife, the mother of his child. When John was about 12 years old, Jessica carefully told him also about the incident when Nicholas had hit him, himself, a little boy, how he had thrown him to the corner of the room when John had stood up for his mom. Goosebumps ran down John's spine at the realization of that horror and pain. He couldn't believe for a long time that it was his own father doing that, a man who was supposed to love, protect, and defend his family, but instead was causing them unbearable suffering. John was truly grateful to fate that he had another man by his side now, his dad, Thomas, sensitive, responsive, and so dear. It was him that John considered a real father and role model. When they were already a happy and friendly family, Jessica suggested that they go together to that abandoned cabin in the woods where they had once found shelter to remind the children of the story of their acquaintance and new beginning. The whole family happily agreed. They arrived in the woods, found a clearing with a house that looked abandoned as well. Stepping inside, Jessica and Thomas felt nostalgic, remembering their first meeting. For the boys, it was an exciting adventure to spend the night as a family in an old house in the middle of the woods. They listened with delight to their parents' stories about those events, how Mom and Dad met and fell in love. In those days, there was an atmosphere of unity, warmth, and love in the forest. In the evenings, everyone sat around the fire, baked sausages, told stories, and played games. One day, a thunderstorm suddenly began. Heavy clouds covered the sky, and a strong wind blew, and then there was a real hurricane. It seemed that the old house was about to collapse from the gusts of wind. Thunder rumbled, lightning flashed. The children huddled fearfully around their parents, but Thomas was not confused. He calmed everyone down and took them to the safest room in the house. Then he boarded up the windows and doors to keep the drafts out. When the storm subsided a little, Thomas lit the fireplace, and the house became cozy. Thomas got chocolate, marshmallows, and flashlights out of his backpack. They had an impromptu picnic right on the living room floor. The kids were so grateful to Thomas. Thanks to his resourcefulness and courage, everyone stayed safe and sound. Now, this story of how the head of the family saved everyone has become a family legend, the story of the hurricane. Once again, it clearly demonstrated to Jessica the fundamental difference between Thomas and her ex-husband, Nicholas. In a critical situation, Nicholas only swore and blamed everyone around him. He never sacrificed his comfort for the well-being of his family, and Thomas did not hesitate to risk himself to shelter and save his loved ones, acted decisively and rationally. His coolness and resourcefulness were admirable. After everything that had happened, Jessica was firmly convinced that with Thomas, she and the children would be safe. With him, they can survive any hardships and storms because he is a real man, a pillar of safety and security for the family. And if you compare it to spineless Nicholas, it's just night and day. With Thomas, Jessica found real peace of mind, love, and care, and thanked fate for this meeting every day. This trip brought the whole family together even more. When they returned home, rested and happy, they remembered this unforgettable adventure for a long time and thanked the abandoned house that had once been the beginning of their new family.